Imagine this. Every product you buy, every trade deal your country signs, every low price you celebrate could all be the ghostly legacy of a war over drugs. A war that wasn't just fought with cannons and ships, but with addiction, humiliation, and manipulation. In this video, we're uncovering why the Opium Wars weren't merely a dark chapter in 19th century history, but the very blueprint that still dictates global trade today. What if I told you that your cheap smartphone, your fast shipping, and even the global dominance of English all trace back to two bloody conflicts over narcotics? Does that sound ridiculous, or does it make a sinister kind of sense? Because history's most powerful lessons rarely die. They echo, they evolve, and they become the system you live in. Let's rewind to the early 1800s. Britain had a problem. It craved Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China wasn't interested in British goods. Silver flowed out of Britain into China, draining the empire's coffers. So what did Britain do? It found something China couldn't resist: opium. British merchants flooded China with opium grown in India. Millions of Chinese became addicted, from peasants to officials. The social fabric began to rot. Productivity fell. Crime soared. Now pause for a second. What does that tell you about the willingness of global powers to weaponize addiction for profit? Is it really so different from the way corporations today push sugar, social media, dopamine, or even gambling apps? Eventually, the Chinese government tried to stop it. Commissioner Lin Zexu famously seized and destroyed 20,000 chests of opium. China's outdated navy couldn't compete with British steamships and modern artillery. Britain's response? War. The First Opium War was a short, brutal affair. The Treaty of Nanking that ended it didn't just force China to pay huge reparations. It pried open 5 ports to British merchants and handed over Hong Kong. Does that sound like free trade to you? Or more like economic blackmail backed by gunboats? And yet, these are the foundations of modern trade market access, secured not by competition, but by coercion. But it didn't stop there. They could station troops, establish settlements immune from Chinese law. China still tried to resist foreign domination. So Britain launched the Second Opium War. This time, they looted Beijing and burned the old Summer Palace, a masterpiece of art and culture, reduced to ashes. Imagine if the Louvre in Paris was set on fire, or the entire British Museum destroyed overnight. That was the scale of loss. After this war, more ports were forced open, more most favored nation clauses written into treaties. Western nations could trade in China almost without restriction. Now here's where it matters to you. The Opium Wars set a global precedent. If a stronger nation wants access to your market, it'll get it through economic pressure or outright war. Once markets open, the structure favors whoever controls shipping, insurance, and banking. Back then, Britain. Today, perhaps the US. China's humiliation taught the West that it could engineer global trade on its terms, and the modern supply chain, it still reflects that imbalance. Cheaper manufacturing often comes at the cost of local sovereignty, environmental safety, or fair wages. Is it any wonder global companies still flock to regions where labor is cheapest and regulations weakest? So think about this. The next time you pick up your phone or order something online, why is your product made thousands of miles away? Why do global shipping lanes favor certain ports and not others? Why does the dollar still dominate international trade long after Britain's empire faded? Because the Opium Wars weren't just about drugs. They were about setting rules. Rules that still define globalization. A world where economic power can override local choice, backed by military force if necessary. It's also why China today pours trillions into modernizing its navy and securing trade routes through initiatives like the Belt and Road. Their entire foreign policy is haunted by the century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars. And in the West, most people barely know what the Opium Wars were. Is that by accident or by design? Because if you realized how many global systems were built on forced addiction and economic bullying, would you still believe in the fairness of free trade? Let's go even deeper. What the British did to China with opium wasn't unique. It was simply the most obvious case of weaponizing addiction. Look at today. Are you really so sure your addictions weren't engineered? From social media notifications triggering dopamine, to snack companies funding flavor labs to find the bliss point, modern corporations learned exactly what the British East India Company put people on something they can't resist, make them dependent, and then profit. Is that capitalism, or just a sophisticated evolution of 19th century opium dens? Now, let's talk money. The Opium Wars weren't fought by random merchants. They were underwritten by massive banks and insurance houses in London. The same families that insured slave ships pivoted seamlessly to underwriting tea, silk, and yes, opium. These financial giants didn't vanish. Their modern names echo through Wall Street and the City of London. When you hear of multinational banks that have existed since the 1800s, remember, some of their original wealth came from narcotics, forcibly sold to a nation that tried desperately to say no. So every international trade agreement, every global currency system, whose rules do you think they still follow? Those who wrote them first, not the nations who suffered under them. Here's something uncomfortable. After the Opium Wars, the British didn't just keep trading drugs. They engineered entire economic systems that maximized extraction. Cheap tea from plantations in India and Ceylon. Cheap textiles from factories powered by colonial raw cotton. Sound familiar? Today, it's cheap electronics from Shenzhen, or garments sewn in Bangladesh under grueling hours. The new opium is consumer debt and disposable products. Get people addicted to upgrading. Trap them in credit systems that funnel interest to the same kinds of institutions that once brokered opium deals. And as you swipe your credit card, whose centuries-old playbook are you really participating in? And China wasn't the only victim. What happened in the Opium Wars? Strong nations forcing weaker ones into open markets under military threat was repeated again and again. In Africa, colonial armies seized entire economies for rubber, gold, diamonds. In the Middle East, oil contracts were secured under threat of regime change. In Latin America, banana republics were literally shaped by fruit companies backed by foreign gunboats, all justified under the banner of free trade. So when modern trade talks stall and you see countries threatened with sanctions, does it feel so different? Here's where it gets almost poetic. China, once broken by opium, now plays by the same global trade rules, but better. They learned from humiliation. They set up special economic zones that attract Western companies seeking cheap labor, flipping the old script. They use debt-trap diplomacy through Belt and Road to secure resources and influence across Africa, Southeast Asia, even Europe. They build ports. China simply points back. And when the West complains, "Didn't you teach us this game?" It's also why Chinese leaders invoke the century of humiliation at every turn. It's deeply embedded in national education, movies, and speeches because it creates unity. It justifies military buildup. It underwrites policies to protect China from ever being bullied again. In a dark twist, the more China remembers, the more suspicious it grows of global systems, many of which still carry the fingerprints of colonial exploiters. So, ironically, the Opium Wars planted seeds of both global trade interconnectedness and deep distrust that could one day fracture it. So when you next marvel at global supply chains, coffee from Ethiopia, phones from China, oil from Saudi Arabia, remember, it all started somewhere, and often that somewhere involves cannons pointed at ports, treaties signed under duress, and a global order birthed, not by mutual benefit, but by conquest and addiction. The Opium Wars never really ended. They just evolved into something so normalized, you barely notice it.